Welcome back to another lecture of Psychology 101. This is your instructor, Dr. Shadi Bashai, and in today's lecture, we will continue talking about personality psychology, and we will talk about the second part of that particular unit on personality, and the entire unit corresponds to chapter 14 of your textbook if you want to follow along. So here we go. Last time we talked about Freudian or psychoanalytic theories of personality development. As you can probably imagine, the sexual nature of Freudian theories made many people uncomfortable at the turn of the 20th century. Accordingly, Freud's closest friends and many of his students actually broke off from Freud intellectually, and they began developing theories of personality of their own, actually. We can call students of Freud who broke off from the initial psychoanalytic approach, we can call them neo-freudians. Literally means the new Freudians, if you will. Like Freud, neo-freudians believed in the driving force of the unconscious drives, and also believed that personality development was pretty much complete in the first few years of life, 5 or 6 years or so. However, they also held many beliefs that were different from classic Freudian thought. For example, they put less of their emphasis on sexual drives, and instead focused on social and cultural drives in shaping personalities. Further, they were less deterministic in their beliefs about human development. So basically, neo-Freudians believe that people or humans can and do in fact change. Alfred Adler was a very close student and friend of Freud's, and he was one of the very first people to break off from Freud. So he's one of the very first neo-Freudians. And Adler emphasized people's drive for something he called superiority. That is, he believed that people's drive to be superior dominated all the other drives. And in sharp contrast to the more sinister interpretations of human nature that Freud emphasized, for example, Adler believed that people create a style of life, something he called lifestyle. And so people create these lifestyles to achieve or move closer to self-improvement. Early experiences also mattered very much in Adler's theory of personality, as he believed that when children are neglected early on in life by their parents, they develop something he called inferiority complex, which is this prolonged pattern of having low self-esteem and overcompensating for this low self-esteem through these grandiose kind of shows of superiority or dominance in social situations. Carl Jung and his theories are perhaps one of the most known of all the neo-Freudians. What was unique about Jung is that he separated the unconscious into two different or distinct parts. He said there is a personal unconscious, which is very similar to Freud's conceptualization of the unconscious. And then he said there's something else called the collective unconscious. And Carl Jung believed that the collective unconscious was a collection of memories that basically are passed down by ancestors from generation to generation. And within the collective unconscious are reoccurring themes, if you will. These are basically cross-culturally universal symbols you'll find in any culture you examine, no matter where they are in the universe. So he called these reoccurring themes archetypes. Here are some examples of these collective archetypes that are cross-culturally applicable according to Jung. So they have themes such as the archetype of the shadow. And the shadow is the dark side of our personality, for example. There's another archetype, we call it the enema, which is the archetype for femininity. The animus, the archetype for masculinity. And finally, the most important collective archetype that Jung believed in and he believed that that was the archetype for self, which he believed he represented, basically it had a symbolic representation through the mandala, which looks something like this. So this is the mandala, which is the representation of self, and they're always circular in form, as you see here. And this represents kind of a totality or wholeness in the concept of self. So as Freud and Neo-Freudians were producing their own theories of personality, behaviorists and behaviorism, as a school of thought in psychology, was becoming increasingly popular. So if you remember our first few lectures, behaviorists believe that if it cannot be directly observed and measured, it is not worth studying, basically. So they really renounced psychoanalysis and its fetishizing, if you will, of the unconscious, because obviously the unconscious by its very nature is intangible, so it cannot be observed and it cannot be measured. So hence behaviorists rejected psychoanalytic conceptualizations of self and instead emphasized observable human behavior as their main object of interest. Indeed, behaviorists believe that personality is nothing more than just a collection of behaviors that people have been rewarded for in the past. So they display the behaviors that they've been rewarded for, and they stop displaying behaviors that they were not rewarded for. Okay, so personality differences basically stem from differences in one's learning history. For this reason, and because we're consistently learning, according to behaviorism, personality development continues throughout life. Behaviorists didn't believe that there is this internal personality, if you will, that drove behavior. They believe that personality is, in fact, one's behavior. They cannot be separated. So to know someone's genetic blueprint and what kind of behaviors they were reinforced for in the past is basically to know what their personality is like. Much like psychoanalysts, behaviorists did not believe that we have a free will. We all, according to behaviorism, are behaving blindly according to our learning history. As mentioned, behaviorists did not believe in anything other than that which they can observe, and therefore they rejected the concept of the unconscious, and the reason why they rejected something like the unconscious because they emphasized the role of external factors in driving behavior as opposed to internal factors, such as the role of the unconscious, for example. As if we did a complete 380, the cognitive approach to personality, which came on the scene in the 1950s and 60s, which is about 30 to 40 years after behaviorism, the cognitive approach to personality emphasized the role of cognition or thought in determining behavior, or internal forces in other words. So the cognitive paradigm held that people are in fact decision makers. That is, they evaluate and they interpret their environment, then make a decision as to how they should behave in that particular environment. So they're not just these automatons, if you will, that are behaving based on some kind of some of their learning histories, for example. Cognitivists had a few key beliefs, if you will. For example, they believed that the behaviorist's explanation of behavior was at best insufficient. It's incomplete. They believed that beyond just reinforcement patterns, people are actually thinking and meaning-making machines. So we're not, like I was saying earlier, we're not these automatons. We actually select our behaviors based on our needs at the time and based on the particular situation we find ourselves in. Perhaps one of the most renowned cognitive psychologists of our time is Albert Bandura, who is this Canadian psychologist who actually graduated from the University of British Columbia, if you're interested. And one of Bandura's most known or influential concepts is a concept he called self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is defined as your beliefs or your perceptions of how well you're going to do a particular behavior, a particular task. So basically, it's your evaluation of whether or not you can successfully complete tasks and whether or not you can successfully complete a certain behavior. Bandura's theory of self-efficacy is a very, very well-researched one. And the research really tells us that self-efficacy beliefs are positively associated. So they're correlated positively with a number of different outcomes, like whether or not you'll engage in certain health behaviors, like taking exercise more seriously or eating more healthily more seriously, and actually positively correlates with how well you'll do in school, for example. Okay, so it's a powerful concept. Self-efficacy is. Bandura and his theories fall in the realm of what we call social learning theories, which basically emphasize the role of thought or cognition in determining people's personality. So our interpretation of our environment plays a pivotal role in social learning theories as an important determinant of our personality. Okay, so since we're not just responding to our learning histories and our genetic blueprint or these unconscious drives according to psychoanalysis, we're also responding to our own interpretations of our environments. From within this social learning theory perspective, Albert Bandura introduced the concept of reciprocal determinism, which simply means that personality, cognition, and environment are all locked in this dynamic relationship. And all of these three are changing one another in this very interesting, non-static kind of relationship. In fact, social learning theories or theorists use the concept of observational learning to demonstrate that the simplistic behavioristic conceptualizations of personality doesn't make a lot of sense. So if people only, and I'll give you an example of exactly what I just mean. If people only behave in accordance with what they have directly been reinforced for in the past, so what they've been rewarded for in the past, so if people only behaved according to what they've directly been awarded for or directly been punished for example, then how do we actually learn from watching others? And there's obviously a lot of evidence to suggest that we learn just basically by watching others. So we learn indirectly. We don't even have to experience the reinforcement or the punishment for us to learn. This is what is meant by observational learning. So I challenge you to stop the video when you're able to do so and watch the YouTube clip on Bandura's famous observational learning studies, which were dubbed the Bobo doll experiment. Cognitive theories could also explain how people's beliefs of how much control they have over their environment, which is a concept called locus of control. So cognitive theories can actually predict how locus or beliefs of locus of control can predict so many real-world outcomes like depression and anxiety. So people with an internal locus of control, so those who believe that forces within them allow them to be able to reach certain goals or reach certain outcomes. Okay, so the forces that would allow them to do that are actually within them. These forces are internal. They have control over these forces. For those who believe that the forces within them allow them to reach certain goals or outcomes, people with internal locus of control appear to experience mental health difficulties at a lower rate than people with an external locus of control, or people who believe, on the other hand, that life outcomes are determined by external forces outside of their control. So people who believe that many of life's outcomes are determined by forces outside of their control tend to have higher rates of depression and anxiety, as you can probably imagine. So that social learning and observational learning theories give us an explanation as to how that could be true. Even though behaviorism was incomplete in its understanding of human personality, it served a very important function in psychology, as it really put the field on a firmer scientific ground in their demand to only study that which is observable, namely behavior. With that said, behaviorism's neglect of the role of cognition or thought is definitely a glaring error and makes behavioristic theories incomplete at best. So on the other hand, so this is a criticism now of social learning theories, the role of observational learning has been criticized in literature, especially when you consider that observational learning would need to occur in mostly shared environments. And we talked about shared environments in the last lecture. Shared environments, turns out, matter less in shaping people's personalities or behavior. So they matter less than unique or non-shared environmental factors. So we talked about Freudian, Neo-Freudian, behaviorist, and cognitive conceptualizations of personality. And now we will discuss the humanistic model of personality. Humanistic models had the rosiest views of human personality, if you will, or human nature. Humanists rejected psychoanalytic and behaviorist notions of determinism or lack of free will, and instead said that people do in fact have a free will. In fact, humanists believe that we all have a basic drive towards something called self-actualization, which is our full potential. It's the peak of human nature. At its core, humanism believed that people are inherently good, and that all that is needed for us to help people reach their full potential, which is self-actualization, all that is needed is for us to create an environment in which people can thrive. Perhaps one of the most prominent humanists is Carl Rogers, who still stands as one of the most influential psychologists of all time. Rogers believed that personality is made up of 3 different parts. The first part is called the organism, and this is the genetic blueprint we all come with. The second part is the concept of self, and people's concept of self. Basically, these are people's beliefs about who they are as people. Okay, so that's the second part of personality according to Rogers' tripartite model of personality. And then the third part is what Rogers called conditions of worth. And these are basically criteria for evaluating what is appropriate or inappropriate behavior. So it's the benchmark we use to figure out which behaviors are appropriate versus inappropriate. And these conditions of worth, or these criteria, Rogers really believed that they come from your parents or they come from society at large. Okay, so that's the 3 parts of Rogers' personality model. Another really influential humanist is someone by the name of Abraham Maslow. Abraham Maslow is actually believed to be the father or the founder of the field of positive psychology. And positive psychology is a movement which is focused on the study of the positive aspects of human nature. Things like, they focus on studying things like optimism, happiness, well-being, etc. So it flips clinical psychology on its head, if you will, and starts focusing more on the positive aspects of psychology. So Maslow was the founder of positive psychology, and he really believed that people have 5 levels of needs, if you will. And these needs progress from those that are purely basic physical requirements, for example, such as, so this is the most basic level here at the bottom, which is the basic need for shelter, food, warmth, etc. So these progress from purely physical and biological needs all the way to the top level, which he called self-actualization. And self-actualization is basically the demonstration of personal growth and fulfillment, if you will. Okay, so it's the peak of human nature that humanists talked about. So to fulfill our esteem needs, for example, so basically Maslow believed that in order for people to reach the final stage, they have to first solve the needs in the lower stages. So it's a stage-like forms of development and very domain-specific, meaning to fulfill your esteem needs, for example, which sit right here, you have to first figure out your belonging and your love needs. Okay, so this is the only way for you to rise up, is to solve the problems as they occur in each level of need. So Maslow set out to study the concept of self-actualization, which again is this concept related to personal growth and fulfillment. So what he did was he focused his efforts on studying people who he believed already achieved self-actualization. For example, he did a deep dive study of people such as Mahatma Gandhi and people such as Martin Luther King Jr. and people such as Helen Keller. So once he studied these cases, he found that self-actualized individuals were more creative, more spontaneous, more accepting of themselves and other people than people who are less self-actualized. And Maslow also noticed that individuals who he believed were self-actualized, such as the individuals that are pictured in the bottom here, he believed that these individuals also experienced what he called peak experiences, which are these moments of complete tranquility, excitement, joy, feeling of connection with the world or something that's bigger than who you are. So Maslow found out that people who he defined as self-actualized experience these peak experiences a lot more often than other people. Like any other theory in science, the humanistic model is, of course, not without its criticisms. One gaping hole in the theory is its very rosy view of human nature, which, of course, is at odds with findings from comparative psychology studies, which is a field of psychology that compares our behavior to behavior of closely related or genetically related species, such as chimps, for example, whom we share 98% genetic overlap. So if you look at chimps and their behavior, aggression is a very common behavior in chimps and other genetically related animals. So it's quite possible that aggression is actually aggression and violence and evil, if you will, are embedded within our genes. Okay, so the rosy view of humanism, the rosy view of human nature that comes out of humanism, is at odds with this particular finding. Criticisms have also come against Maslow and his studies of self-actualization. Maslow may have fell prey to what we call the circular reasoning fallacy. Basically, he defined what self-actualization might look like. So he defined it as, people who might be creative and spontaneous, etc. And then he set out to find exactly those things in the people he believed had self-actualization. So that is, he found exactly what he was looking for without actually anchoring it in anything that's valid. He said self-actualization is X, Y, and Z, and these people show X, Y, and Z, therefore they are self-actualized. It's a bit of a circular reasoning fallacy. That is like psychoanalysis before it, and that is the final criticism. Like psychoanalysis before it, some humanistic concepts are extremely difficult to test empirically, and therefore they're difficult to falsify. Okay, which stands as also a pretty major criticism to humanistic theories of personality. Enter trait models of personality or trait theories of personality. And trait theories of personality have roots in the structuralist school of thought we also talked about early on in our lectures. And the structuralists were interested in finding the basic constituents, if you will, or the basic structure of the human psyche. Similarly, trait models of personality were interested in finding the basic structure of human personality. Interest in this particular field dates back to the work of a very famous psychologist by the name of Gordon Allport. So Gordon Allport was really prominent in the 1930s and the 1940s. And what he did was he basically assembled a very large list of trait-related words and then asked a large number of people to rate themselves from 0 to 5, for example, on these particular traits. Okay, so this is a massive list of different words describing different personality traits, and then he brought in a large representative sample to rate how much they would agree that they have these traits from 0 to 5, if you will. Okay, and then what he did was that he subjected these ratings to a statistical technique that was new at the time, that was called factor analysis. And factor analysis simply takes a very large amount of factors, such as the number of different words that Allport was using in his measurement. So it takes a very large number of factors, and then it kind of bundles them together, sorts them together based on how well they correlate with one another. So it reduces many factors into a smaller number of constituent factors. For example, what concept, bigger concept if you will, encapsulates the smaller concepts of cheerful, outgoing, and sociable? Do they share something in common? And the answer is yes. These are all factors associated to the big 5 factor, and more on that later. The big 5 factor we call extroversion, which is how much you're energized by other people around you. So a factor analysis would take the concept such as popularity, liveliness, sociability, right? So we take these 3 factors and look at the correlations between them. And if you see here, these are the correlations between them, 0.78, 0.82, 0.70. These are pretty high correlations that would happen at a much higher frequency, very rarely due to chance, is what I'm trying to say. So basically it takes these 3 concepts, popularity, liveliness, sociability, and based on how well they correlate with each other, it tells you whether these concepts, these 3 concepts, belong to a bigger concept. And actually it does, and it belongs to the concept we call extroversion. Similarly, concepts such as, or at least personality descriptors such as risk-taking, sensation-seeking, and impulsivity, these 3 factors are very closely related, and they basically belong to the same bigger concept, which we later call openness to experience. Okay, so that's factor analysis. And this push to get at the basic structure of personality is a defining factor of what we call trait and type theories of personality. Trait is defined as any identifiable or stable quality that people demonstrate across time and across different situations. For example, extroversion or being conscientious. These are basic traits that people display across time and across different situations if they are said to have these traits. Type, on the other hand, is a collection of traits. So it's a more higher order or bigger concept than is a trait, as it's made up of, actually. So the constituent parts of a type is a trait. The concept of personality type is alive and well in the public sphere. A very popular test is called the Myers-Briggs personality types, which is this guy right here. And the Myers-Briggs personality types is a test that is very much used to predict job fit in business institutions, so it's still very commonly used. And the Myers-Briggs claims that people's traits can be configured, if you will, into one of 16 possible different traits, or 16 possible different types. So people's traits can be configured in one of 16 types, and the test develops a roadmap of which personality type fits best in which vocational or social environment. Okay? So despite its continued use, research actually tells us that the Myers-Briggs personality type test is not a very reliable or valid test, unfortunately. So here is a link that provides you with a little bit more information about the nature of this particular personality type test. So if you do have the time and chance to go and check it out. So back to Gordon Allport. Now I'm really back to Gordon Allport. And that's, of course, the psychologist that categorized a large list of personality descriptors into a smaller number of traits. His theory is called the personal disposition theory. And basically, Gordon Allport's theory purports that there are 3 types of traits that people possess. The first is what he called a cardinal trait. And a cardinal trait is a trait that is so powerful that the person's entire life pretty much revolves around that one cardinal trait. There are what Allport called central traits, which are traits that are displayed on a regular or daily basis. And then, of course, there are the secondary traits, which are traits that, according to Allport, are only exhibited in certain situations that call upon that trait to be displayed or exhibited. So another very influential trait theorist is by the name of Hans Eysenck. And he also had a factor theory of personality. And he was also interested in types. And if you remember, types are higher order traits. So they're a form of kind of super traits that includes traits within them, if you will. So traits are the constituent factors within types. And then there are, according to Eysenck's factor theory, there are what he called lower order qualities, or what he called habits. Okay, so that's the basic units of personality according to Eysenck's factor theory. Eysenck's factor theory of personality argued that all traits can be encompassed or grouped together under 3 massive super traits. So if your personality can be summed up, if you will, it will be summed up along 3 dimensions if we know exactly where you stood along these 3 dimensions. The first is the extroversion-introversion dimension, which is basically how energized you are by others, hence introversion or extroversion. So extroversion is how energized you are by other people and how outgoing you are, versus being an introvert, which is how draining you find it to be around other people, and hence a lower need to be social. The second dimension is neuroticism versus stability. And neuroticism here is how emotionally unstable you are, and how often, how long, and how intensely you experience negative emotions, such as anger, anxiety, depression, etc. Versus the other side of that continuum, which is stability, which is how emotionally stable you are, and the fact that you may exhibit very little to no negative affect or emotion. The third dimension in Eysenck's factor theory is what he called psychoticism and superego functioning. And psychoticism is basically people's proneness for psychotic tendencies. Their basic tendencies to disregard reality. And that's on one end of the continuum. On the other end of the continuum is what he called superego function, which is how grounded you are in reality, and the display of appropriate social and emotional regulation when the time calls for them. Until next time.